Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a fantastic day. If you've already watched my hour-long review of the Shadow of the Erdtree, you'll already know what the 8 new weapon categories are and a little bit about them. Now I want to expand on this and use my knowledge to help you determine your early game goals for the DLC, and more specifically, which new weapon type you want to focus on first. Therefore, I've created this new 2-part mini-series where we'll take a look at 4 of the new weapon types in each video and compare them to a few similar already existing weapons from the base game. And after watching, you'll know if this base game weapon is your favourite, then this new weapon category is probably going to be the one for you. And after I've covered each category, I'll also give you an example build you can use to help get you through the early parts of the Shadow of the Erdtree until you're able to flesh out a better build using all of the new weapons and items. Let's start off by taking a look at the Great Katana. You may initially think, well, it's literally got Katana in the name, right? So the Katana weapon type is probably the most similar. However, you have to take into account the fact that this is a Great Katana, and it weighs just about as much as a standard greatsword, if not more. And due to that weight, it's going to have a wildly different moveset to the standard Katana. There is in fact a different weapon type in this video that I would recommend if katanas are among your favourite weapons, and it is guaranteed to surprise you. However, as we're looking at the Great Katana for now, the weapon type from the base game I think is the most similar is actually going to be the curved greatsword. We're looking at things like the Bloodhound's Fang. From the initial testing, it is very similar to the whole category of curved greatswords. It has big flowy move sets, it's very stylish, but obviously as with the curved greatsword, the Great Katana is far slower and far heavier than its counterpart. Just as you wouldn't really compare the curved sword with the curved greatsword. They have wildly different movesets and playstyles due to their vastly differing weights. Therefore, if you do like heavier, meatier weapons such as the curved greatsword or maybe even the standard greatswords, then the Great Katana could be an absolutely fantastic brand new weapon category for you. And just before we move on to the build that I recommend, to give you a few more examples of weapon categories similar to the new Great Katana weapon type, this will probably be your favourite weapon, at least initially, if your current favourite builds revolve around the likes of certain spears, halberds and scythes, particularly those with big sweeping movesets such as the Halo Scythe, the Dragon Halberd or the Cross Naginata. As I say, now let me give you my favourite build that I recommend you use if you're going into the DLC with the hopes of maining the Great Katana as your weapon of choice. And we'll use the curved greatsword as an example, because of course we need a weapon, we need a build to actually take into the DLC to be able to collect and gather up these new items and weapons. Firstly, as mentioned in my overview of the DLC video, level 150 is a really good level to go into the DLC. And for this build, the highest stats you'll be prioritizing are Vigor and Dexterity. Dexterity, you want to try and reach the hard cap of 80 to get the absolute most out of your damage, and Vigor at least 50, eventually up to 60 if you start to level up a little bit further. The only other 3 stats that are quite important is going to be 20 in both Mind and Endurance, so that you can wear some decently strong armor and not be too squishy, and also cast plenty of buffs and still have the FP left over to summon Spirit Ashes if you want help from your summons. And finally, 25 Faith, allowing you to cast the various buffs that we'll be using for this build. Now, all of them levels, especially if you're trying to get Vigor up to 50 or 60, won't be doable at level 150, however it will be using Godric's Great Rune. I have saved up 50 rune arcs on my main character who's still on the base new game, so that I can permanently have Godric's Great Rune active until my build goes from level 150 to around level 200 when I shouldn't need to rely on it as much anymore. And hopefully you've been following my DLC prep guides and you have done the same. So just to very quickly recap, once you've got 60 Vigor, 80 Dex, 20 Mind, 20 Endurance and 25 Faith, this is when any extra stats can start going into increasing your strength to get even more damage out of your Great Katana. For now, looking at the curved greatsword build, using the Bloodhound's Fang as an example, We'll be taking a look at an insanely powerful bleed build, because we can assume that most great katanas will also have inherent blood loss buildup. And even if they don't, at the very least, you can go and change the affinity to give them bleed, as this will make this particular build 20 times more powerful. So for the talismans, ideally, you're going to have the Ritual Sword Talisman, the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, the Shard of Alexander, and the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia. If you did want to swap one out for a bit more survivability, such as the Erdtree's Favor +2 or one of the damage reduction talismans, then the one I would opt to switch out is the Ritual Sword Talisman, because of course this only gives us that boost whilst we are at full HP. So in tougher fights, it will definitely lack over the other three. Next up, you definitely want Bloodflame Blade, Golden Vow, and Flame Grant Me Strength for your 3 faith buffs. All of these are going to drastically increase your damage output. For your mixed physic, I recommend the Dexterity Knot tier and the Stone Barb tier. These will increase both your damage output and your stance break, meaning you are staggering enemies so frequently, barely leaving them a chance to retaliate. And finally, if you want to take it one step beyond, you could start to mix up and apply some Blood Boil aromatics as well, though I tend to not do this, usually because I just forget. And with this whole build together, as you see here, you do thousands and thousands of damage per hit. That's without even proccing the bleed procs, of which most enemies in the game are susceptible to. This is a devastating build that will see you blitz through the first part of the DLC until you can start to really relearn your skills, collect loads of new equipment and items to flesh out your new build, make it even stronger, and help you tackle the plethora of new challenges waiting round every corner. Now that we've talked about the Great Katana, the next one I'm going to look at in part 1 of this series is the Backhand Blade. For anyone who needs a quick recap, the Backhand Blade at the moment is my favourite of the 8 new weapon categories, especially the specific weapon art that was on the Backhand Blade that we were given, called Blind Spot. The blade itself is awesome with a very flashy, very fast moveset, but it really shines when you two-hand it. When you two-hand it, it actually splits into dual backhanded swords, and oh my god are they fast. They are going to be incredible for status effect heavy builds because of the power and speed at which they attack. During our initial play session, I put bleed on mine and I was proccing bleed with nearly every single combo. As for the weapon art itself, Blind Spot, in a single press of the button, you will spin 180 degrees behind your target and immediately hit them in the back, meaning that this ability is fantastic both defensively and offensively, making this lethal in almost every single situation. My recommendation for people who will really want to specialize in the Backhand Blade for their first DLC playthrough are lovers of curved swords and twin blades. Specifically dual-wielding curved swords. Both of these weapons have similar movesets to the Backhand Blade, though admittedly nowhere near as cool. Genuinely, I don't think any weapon in the base game compares to the awesomeness of the Backhand Blade. And as we move into talking about a base game build, which you will then be able to translate over to your new backhanded blades, an absolute favourite for me has always been dual Beastman's curved swords, specifically with the blood affinity and seppuku applied. Two big ways in which they differ from the Bloodhound's Fang and the new Great Katana is, firstly, this will give them arcane scaling, meaning your bleed procs are going to be even more regular. And of course, the stat they primarily scale with is strength over dexterity. If you do want me to go a bit more specific on what your stats should look like for using the dual Beastman's curved sword build, if you want a proper, thorough rundown, then I will link you to my previous video, so I'm not regurgitating too much information. But for those who just want a super quick rundown, because the primary stat scaling is in strength, you want to dump most of your points into strength. I'd advise 50 to 60 for slightly lower level builds, or if you're willing to get your level up into the 200s, then try and get it to 80. And the blood loss build-up side of things will continue to gain benefit from your arcane stat well into the 50s or 60s, Or if you don't want to dump too many stats into that, you could also make sure you've got plenty of blood grease or apply blood flame blade to your weapon, which will help to increase the amount of bleed buildup per hit without needing to dump loads of stats into arcane. This way you then have more points left over for the likes of vigor and endurance, so you can be really tanky to help you deal with lots of the new tough challenges in Shadow of the Erdtree. Of course, this video isn't supposed to be a really specific min-maxed build guide, one of the primary reasons being the variety and the versatility of builds in this game. So even though I'm telling you now it scales mostly with strength and arcane, that entirely depends on the type of curved sword and the type of backhand blade that you're using, and also the affinity that you put on it. So take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt and tailor it to your preferred build. With that in mind though, I have covered a full build guide of the devastation of the Beastman's Blood Affinity curved sword in its own separate build guide video, so most of you probably already know how insanely powerful this combination is. And this, combined with the exact same physic buffs and the exact same faith spell buffs that I just talked about for the Great Katana build, will see you through the first part of the DLC absolutely no problems. You will be melting everything, and it will be nowhere near as intimidating as many people believe it to be. Trust me, you can do this. If you beat Elden Ring, you can beat the DLC. And then with your newfound confidence, if you haven't done before, you can go and beat all of the Dark Souls games as well. I should say as well, because I haven't touched on armor at all yet, my advice for your armor set will be the same throughout all of these builds in both parts of this mini-series. Just use the heaviest armor you can get away with, whilst still keeping yourself in a medium load. And if you find you're dying a bit more frequently than you would like to, just stick on the Great Jar's Arsenal, which will dramatically increase your equip load, and then you can wear a much heavier, much tankier set of armor. And with that advice out the way, let's move on to the third new weapon type, hand to hand. The new martial arts style of weapons in Shadow of the Erdtree. It was so hard for me to match this up against any currently existing categories because it is so different. And you may think that it's most comparable to the likes of claws or fists, but in practice this is wildly different from both of these weapon types. Specifically, if we take fists as an example for a second, if you look at something like the Iron Ball or the Spiked Cestus or the Star Fist, most builds that revolve around these weapons and use them effectively and efficiently rely on big, slow, heavy, charged R2s and staggering and stun-locking enemies almost instantly, whereas hand-to-hand differs from this wildly. As I mentioned in my previous video, you do need to remember to switch into two-handed mode when using the hand-to-hand weapons, or you will just be flailing around with one fist, and it's nowhere near as effective. However, hand-to-hand combat is probably, if I had to pick one, most similar to katanas or daggers, just due to their speed. They are so nimble and do crazy amounts of damage, and probably more similar to katanas than daggers, because they do have some decent stance break damage as well. And from the few hand-to-hand specific Ashes of War I found, the builds you can create with these weapons are so varied and so outside of the box, it's unreal. With weapon arts that deal inherent Scarlet Rot damage, crazy new interactions that are specific to martial arts weapons, and a moveset the likes of which I have never seen in Souls games. And combine that with the fact that they work really well with spellcaster builds as well. Don't forget, from my play session, they gave us the new hand-to-hand dry leaf arts weapon on our sorcerer build. This was a faith int hybrid build, and the martial arts weapon that we had to wield worked so damn well with this build. As for the build that I recommend going into the DLC if you are wanting to opt for hand-to-hand weapons, this was a bit more difficult to put together for you because they are so versatile and they have so much variety in their potential builds. Also, my stat line is a bit of a mess at the moment as I've tried to cover all bases for the various builds that I'm showing off for you. However, if this is the weapon that you would like to run initially for the DLC, then this is what your stat line should probably look like if you are using the Dex Int hybrid and dual wielding the 2 intelligence katanas. You don't want your intelligence stat to be too high because the meteoric ore blade doesn't scale anywhere near as well with int as the moonveil does. So really just get your intelligence as high as you would like to use some of the more powerful intelligence spells. So probably somewhere between 40 to 45. Then for your other damaging stats, both strength and dex are quite good at bumping up the damage done by both of these katanas, but I would favour dexterity over strength just slightly. So unlike most other builds where you want to ideally get 80 in just one stat, having somewhere between 40 to 50 in both dexterity and intelligence, and then around 30 to 40 in strength would be absolutely perfect. You've got such a versatile build then, and you are going to be able to switch over to many other weapons with ease. And then obviously the usual recommendation in all of the other stats based on how many stat points you have left over. I'd always advise using the same few tried and tested buffs. Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength tend to work with pretty much any build. They are so great at buffing the damage output of anything you do. Along with that, simply because my stat line's a bit of a mess at the moment for the purposes of all the different builds I'm juggling, I specifically am running the Prince of Death's staff. But any of the staffs that I recommended from my top 10 secondary weapons to take with you into the DLC video are going to serve you very, very well for the purposes of this build. And then the 2 katanas that synergize perfectly with what we are trying to do, Meteoric Ore Blade and the Moonveil, both scaling decently well with intellect, both giving us a physical, magical attack power hybrid. Chuck on whatever talismans you want to increase your damage and your stats even further. And then add on the magic shrouding tier and the intelligence knot tier to your mixed physic to increase both your intellect and your magic attacks even further, and you will be absolutely wrecking face in both melee and from very far away with this build. And finally, before we move on to the last build for the video, you really can just use whatever spells you find the most fun. I really like Comet. With this build, you should have more than enough intellect to be able to use it, and considering how fast it fires, it does such a stupid amount of damage. You've then got my favourite spell in the game, the Magic Glint Blade, because it is still the most efficient amount of damage versus FP cost in the game. And the final one that I've got equipped, just because it looks cool as hell, is the Carian Phalanx. And now finally, the 4th new weapon type we'll be looking at to round off this video is the Throwing Blade, and then we'll take a look at the other 4 new weapon categories in part 2, so make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for that one in a couple of days. This was a really hard weapon to try and compare anything to, considering it's a melee weapon that you throw. It really is completely different to any other weapon category currently in the game, aside from other ranged weapons. So really all I can say is if your current playstyle involves ranged rather than melee, then throwing blades may be for you. As you'll already know from my 1-hour breakdown of everything we know so far, the 2 throwing blades that have been confirmed are the Smith Script Axe and the Smith Script Dagger, both of which operate practically the same, except the axe is more focused around strength and the dagger is more focused around dexterity. But really, I'd say these weapons compare most similarly to the likes of the black bow or the bully crossbow, and other weapons in that general vicinity. I already reviewed both of these ranged weapons as being 2 of the absolute best that you should level up, max out, and take into the DLC with you. But unlike the throwing blade, I wouldn't really advise specifically building your character around a ranged weapon such as a bow or a crossbow. This is more of a support tool, and you definitely want another weapon type to be your primary weapon. With that being said, quicker axes and hammers, and really any physical damage focused quality build weapon, I think would be really good to accompany a throwing blade build. And with that, you now know my personal recommendations for what to focus on if you're planning on using the Great Katana, the Throwing Blade, the Backhand Blade, or hand-to-hand martial arts. Make sure you keep your ears and eyes peeled for part 2, where we will be covering light greatswords, beast claws, perfume bottles, and thrusting shields. And of course, if you want to stay completely up to date with all of my new Shadow of the Erdtree content, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join the Discord. And with that, my friends, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.